Hey there, Banditos! Welcome back to another episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits on this Wednesday, November 16th. I am Joe Marcello.
I am Mike Farah.
And our buddy Oren is not able to join us. Unfortunately, he's a little bit under the weather, but as always, we soldier on. We hope you all are having a great, stupendous week so far, and we hope the rest of the week is just as good. And as always, we're bringing you a little comic book awesomeness right in your ear holes. And today we're bringing you our interview with DG Chichester. DG was a film student that ended up in the comic book biz and ended up as an assistant to the then Marvel editor, Jim Shooter. He then went on to an editorial job himself and then moved on to writing. He's written for titles such as Batman, Daredevil, and even Punisher.
I know DG primarily through his long 4-year run on Daredevil, which included some memorable storylines like Fall of the Kingpin with Lee Weeks, great art on that one, and Fall from Grace, also great art. Um, and in the middle of this, they revised or reimagined Daredevil's costume, and we get into all of that. I dig that costume. You may or may not, but I think you should. And we'll talk about Daredevil and Epic and all of the work with Jim Shooter. So let's get to it. This is DG Chichester.
I'm really good, guys. Thanks for having me on this evening. It's terrific to be here.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to ask you the first question we ask all our guests, and that is, how did you discover comics?
How did I discover comics? That's a really good question that I don't think anyone has asked me before. My cousin, my older cousin, who I sort of idolized when I was young, probably an attempt to get rid of me and have me not bug him so much, gave me a stack of stuff, Mad magazines, comics, just a random collection, but it felt like a treasure trove, of stuff, things he had in his room and back in his closet. And that was what I remember as the real main line that really got me started on that. And then the hooks were in. And then from that point forward, I was either buying them on my own or trying to convince my, parents when we would go away on a weekend or whatever, stop at that flea market, stop at that dusty old looking barn. I bet you there's something good in there. And then just kept amassing comics over time until a point at which I just stopped for whatever reason.
Fair enough.
Until I somehow got a job at Marvel. But that was my first impression and really what got me going.
Do you still have any of those?
I probably do, but I think that first collection is probably pretty ragged because my first attempt to keep the comics together was I had this kind of weird barrel. It was sort of decorated for something, and so it wasn't just like a barrel from Breaking Bad or something, but it was this large oversized barrel that had this kind of decorated exterior, and it was at the back of my closet. And for some reason I thought this was a special place to keep my special magazines. So I had everything just stacked on top of each other. And then whenever I wanted to find anything, I had to, of course, remove everything, which over time would cause problems with pages and covers. But that was, so those really degraded in that storage system.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
We don't hear too many folks that keep their comics in a cylindrical shape.
Yeah.
Usually it's more square cube type.
Yes, but no, I had to try something different, and it didn't work out. But just for folks who were thinking of that, going in that direction.
So you broke into the industry, as our research indicates, and our research could be wrong because we do very surface research, during college. And you got a job with Marvel under Jim Shooter, although I see that it says, at least according to our research, assistant to the assistant to Jim Shooter. Is that correct?
Assistant to the assistant. I mean, Lynn Cohen would, I'm sure, and probably correctly identify that her actual title was, I'm sure, executive administrator or something like that. But technically, she was Jim Shooter's assistant. and therefore I was Lynn Cohen's assistant. So shit runs downhill, and so there was things that you know, I would just have to pick up on and do whatever, run some strange, funny, kooky errand for Shooter, or you know, go harass people for Lynn. But it was an amazing place to be. I was literally at the center of everything, right outside Jim Shooter's office, you know, well within earshot of him pontificating or railing people out, or just being Jim Shooter. And everybody, of course, crossed through that little nexus. So you kind of met everybody, and you observed everything, and you got to answer the phone on random days when people would call Marvel and the receptionist didn't know what to do. They just got routed back for some reason to Jim Shooter's office. And so I would field calls from people who really shouldn't be talking to Jim Shooter, and and answering strange questions. There was one kid who, for the better part of, well, probably the whole time I was there during that job, would call every day at, I would say, 3:30, and he would combine different characters. Can Spider-Man beat the Hulk? You know, can the Hulk beat Iron Man? Can Iron Man beat Hawkeye? It was always, you know, just the, and that was it. Like, that was the question. And I knew the characters, but I would just start making stuff up. And over time, this became known that this kid was going to call, and I would put him on speakerphone, and a bunch of people would be gathered around, and we would listen to him absorb whatever random, well, he beat him, but for this reason, or no, it wouldn't. So we had fun with that.
That was
Did you ever read the... Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to ask if you ever thought of redirecting him toward the, you know, the mailbag pages, and have him actually write out and have a response with his name in print.
Never, because it was too much fun to talk to. You know, he was from down south. He had a thick accent, and he was just so earnest. You know, I recognize now as probably more snarky and sarcastic as I was thinking about it then. But you know, it was just that bold, blatant question. So you wanted to kind of answer him, but at the same time, you're like, you're calling every day.
I find it funny hearing all these stories. It just seems like these offices, man, were just the easiest places to access, because people just walk in looking for jobs. Mm-hmm. You can call up and ask about characters. Now, got to give an eye, you know, a retinal scan and a blood, blood sample just to get into the front door.
Changed. Right. I mean, there was nominal security. You couldn't just wander right in, but people were very accessible. And you know, when you think about it in terms of stopping in at reception and people saying, I've got some samples to show. And if John Romita happened to be walking by at that time, I think there was probably a 83% chance that John might say, let me look at your stuff. You know, people were very accommodating in that way. If you went in and said, I want to talk to John Romita, you might not necessarily get that, but there would be those moments where people would just, you know, invite you in or look at stuff. People were invariably a little bit more disappointed, I think, if they came to the Marvel offices thinking that everybody was going to be there, right? The bullpen idea that Stan had implanted in everybody was everybody who possibly works on these comics is here. Right. But the bullpen, of course, was the production staff. And the people who were primarily there were the editors. And right. Now and again, you would have freelancers coming through. But that wasn't, you know, the hour by hour occurrence. So
in reference to some of the work you've done, Oren wanted us to ask this one. So this is from him. Okay. In reference to Terror Inc.
Yes.
And basically, was Marvel... Well, so basically, first off, what was the impetus behind that? And he particularly really enjoyed, I guess, his involvement with Wolverine.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that was a good, fun story. Yep.
And basically, you know, where he wanted to know, were there too many books and stories at the time where, you know, that Marvel was publishing, and maybe Terror just didn't kind of catch on or got lost in the shuffle?
Possibly. Let's back it up a little bit for listeners or viewers who don't maybe know this. So Terror Terror Incorporated was a book about a nominal assassin mercenary called Terror, because we're incredibly creative in comics. And his shtick, which was fairly original at the time and probably still is to some extent, was he looked like hell. He looked like zombie-esque, or, one step removed from death, with some strange accoutrements on his face, some weird spikes that Klaus Janson had decided to design into the character when he designed it. And he could grab body parts from his victims and take them, and then use them with the essence of whoever he grabbed it from. So if he grabbed a sniper's eye, he could target things. If he grabbed a kickboxer's legs, he could fight like a kickboxer. And then the other side of that was he would also get the emotional components of it. So he'd be dealing not just with the physical abilities, but also having to deal with the fact that that sniper was the military and was missing the daughter he hadn't seen for 12 months. So this incredibly icy, sarcastic, erudite boogeyman assassin was trying to do his job while dealing with these emotional things. And of course, once he had the pieces, they would start to rot and they would ultimately have to be replaced. So Carl Potts said, you basically designed a character around yourself. At one point. So the impetus for Terror was actually a character that had been created in a line of Epic Comics books. So I first started working for Epic Comics. Epic Comics was primarily the creator-owned division of Marvel. But at one point, Archie Goodwin, who was our boss and wonderful mentor and overlord in that division, decided that to give Epic a little bit more of an identity, instead of just an eclectic range of things, that it should have a sort of a line of its own. This is at a time where everybody was creating a universe, right? Everybody had a different universe of books. So Archie created a line of books called the Shadow Line, which were, the shadows were super powered meta characters, meta-humanist characters who had always existed in the shadows of humanity, and for various reasons were coming to light in these books. One of these characters, Saint George, was a human, not a shadow, but had been granted shadow technology, suit of armor, to fight evil. Well, we needed a big bad for this character before the term big bad was around. And I was co-writing this book with a woman named Margaret Clark at the time, who I wrote all the Shadowline books with. And we couldn't for the life of us come up with a character. So we were both in New York City, both living in New York City. We were at Margaret's apartment writing. And it was the hottest day of the year, no air conditioning, Brooklyn. My allergies were killing me. I remember this horrible heat. My eyes are burning out. And I literally just, we couldn't come up with this character. Who's going to be the villain? And I said, I would pay somebody for them to rip the eyes out of my skull at one point, I said. And in that moment, we just said, wait a minute, there's something there. Somebody pays to take your body parts. And then we began to riff on this character, and he became, in essence, almost fully born into this assassin foil. Well, the Shadowline books ended, and those characters kind of just went into the dustbin of Marvel. But a year or so later, Carl Potts, who was the editor on many things, Punisher especially, probably well known for that, called me up and said, listen, Marvel's thinking of doing a series of books with the monster characters, Werewolf by Night, maybe Dracula, Frankenstein Unbound, I don't know, whatever. But we want a Crypt Keeper-like character that sort of ties them together. And we think the character was called Shrek in the Shadowline, which is German for terror, and not the troll, ogre. And he said, would you bring that over? What would you think about bringing that character over to Marvel? They owned it anyway, but he said, what would you think about bringing it over? He's going to play this boogeyman Crypt Keeper role. And I was like, yeah, I love the character. Why not? We started to develop that, and then they canceled that. They decided they didn't want to go any further. So it's like, okay, well, I guess that's not going anywhere. But Carl said, well, no, they're not going to do that anymore. But why don't you just continue to do this? Why don't you develop this into its own standalone book? And then it fell under this line of books called The Big Guns. So there was a series of characters that were coming out at the same time. Silver Sable was one. There was a couple from the UK. and they were all sort of hard as mercenary characters, which this sort of fit under. There was a Punisher book in there. Well, this was the last of the bunch, right? And every book was supposed to have, long way around, every book was supposed to have a special something, you know, a variant cover, a scratch and sniff, you know, a glow in the dark, fold your own gun. I don't know. You know, they all had something, or were promised something. Well, my book was the last of the bunch. And when we got to it, all of a sudden we didn't get the special something. We didn't get the thing. Now, I don't know if they had just run out of promotional money at that point, or somebody finally realized what the hell we were doing. But it just never got the attention, you know, I think it should have, in terms of that push. Got some good reviews. But conversely, with the time that's going on, I can also look at it and say, man, I don't know how we got away with what we were doing. Not that we were trying to get away with anything, but it was a really weird idea, a really violent character, a really, you know, I think it's probably more appropriate for right now than it was at that time. Although I'm immensely proud of everything that we did and the stories that we told and the people we had involved with it. But where did it fit? You know, and it wasn't, I mean, I've heard about it a lot from people as I've met them, you know, over the years, and said, hey, that book was really wild, or, you know, that one stuck with me. But it wasn't the sort of thing that maybe fit the mold right then and there as some things would. I mean, I would put him wherever I was writing something else, you know, when I had a chance to do those Wolverine books. I said to Bob Harris, you know, could I bring this character into it? Yeah, I don't care what you're going to do. You're going to save Larry 2 months of work and do whatever the hell you want, you know. You know, when I was writing Daredevil, I wanted him to show up. You know, nobody was really going to get in my way. You know, so we were able to populate him then, you know, here and there, but it wasn't like he was being picked up by many other creative teams, you know, to do things with. But he's a ball. He's a fun, twisted, you know, interesting character.
Definitely the type of character that would fit in today and any number of, you know, series, you know, that are, let's say, like Deadpool-esque, or
right,
you know, along those lines,
right,
with that type of you know, certainly the violence. And it's a, you know, especially when you talk about the emotional baggage, if you will, that comes along with that. You know, you think about, well, he takes a body part and sticks it on here. Okay, well, he's got that, you know, whatever skill that arm has. You don't think about, well, now he's got to deal with the PTSD that person was managing before that. So that's
exactly.
And you know, when that just kind of kicks in, the light goes off, or, you know, whatever. Anyway, so,
and that's fun. I mean, that makes the character more than just violent.
Absolutely,
or sarcastic as he was, or anything. It gives you an additional layer to, you know, to work out.
Yeah.
I feel like there are times at Marvel, and probably times at DC as well, where the character or the amount of experimentation expands, and then sometimes it contracts. And, you know, it feels like that period, you know, that they were trying to go for something with these mercenary characters, and this may have been a little outside of the box, whereas in a different time period that would have been something exactly would have fit sort of their new mandate. You know?
Possibly. I mean, I you know, I don't hold any sour grapes around things now as I did then. You know, I would have liked whatever we were promised, whatever variant thing. At whatever point we got to, the book only ran 13 issues. We knew the sales weren't doing great by like issue, I want to say 10, maybe, you know, or something like that. But we were promised initially, well, you have until 20 or something like that to turn it around. You know, we were given a little bit of runway. So we started to make plans to try to do certain things and whatever, guest stars or boosted, or we're going to do this, that, or the other thing. And then they just pulled the plug on 13, which is kind of why it ends a little bit abruptly. But again, you know, it was a chance to do something that I never thought I would do with a character that really should not have even had a light of day from the Shadowline stuff. And I know he's popped up here and there again in various places. I haven't really tracked it well. I read one thing where he started dropping his G's and dressing poorly, and I just said, you're missing the point. So I moved on from that one.
Understandable. So we tend to bounce around a lot in your career, so I hope you don't get
I'll try to keep up.
But there's a period, after you had started as assistant to the assistant, and you're rising through the ranks, you get to editor at Marvel, you're there for a while, and then you make a decision to stop being editor, or at least stop being a salaried employee of Marvel, right, to go out and do freelance. I'm just wondering, from a career perspective, what went into that decision? Why sort of give up a good safe gig for something that's a little more risky?
A lot more risky when you think about it. But I was young, impossibly young when I think about it, of what I was doing, and the responsibilities I was being given to write the characters I was being given. So it feels like the world's out in front of you, probably in a lot of ways. But I ultimately, what I wanted to do was to write or create things. I had never thought about going into comics as a career. I was meant to make films. I went to film school. The comics was a little bit of a stopover in a way. The editorial gig was amazing. It could also be frustrating in certain ways. There had been a lot of changes within the Epic group. Working with Archie Goodwin was an unbelievable opportunity, and something I never would have expected from somebody that I knew him by reputation, knew his stories, knew him from an editorial credits. I'm working with this guy. How does this happen? When he was kind of forced out of Marvel and went to DC, the Epic group that had been part of it, that he had led and had a very distinct identity, got sort of lost a little bit. And young, full of testosterone and chips on the shoulder, you're ruining a good thing. You guys don't know what you're doing. I'd had a couple of editorial run-ins with some higher ups on some Hellraiser work that I was doing, and was trying to push for what that book should be. Won those battles, but it was a little bit of a grind. We're doing a book called Clive Barker's Hellraiser. It's supposed to upset people, not intentionally. Like, we're not trying to do it just to goad people, but I would think this is going to exactly. I'm going to push the envelope here a little bit. So that was definitely, quote unquote, time to do my own thing a little bit, and also I was paid okay, not really, actually, when you think about it. It wasn't terribly lucrative to be on staff. That's why a lot of editors also did supplementary freelance work, even while they were editing. There's a little bit of nepotism, or inside the group, sharing of things there. But I started to calculate it and said, this will be more financially advantageous if I can win the assignments. Now, when I decided to go, I didn't have any assignments. Right? I had nothing. The minute I decided to do it is when I started to knock on doors and say, hey, by the way, can I assign myself to that, or who's got this, or whatever. And then fortunately certain things, kicked in relatively quickly and allowed me then to have a good runway for that way. But it felt like the right thing to do to exercise creative storytelling. The hope would be it would be financial, and then the hope would be by raising my profile in that way, that would be a stepping stone to whatever was going to be next, right? Yep. Comics will lead to games or movies or something, in that way.
Makes sense.
So I'm curious, and I apologize in advance if this is a stupid question, but You know, a lot of it's not uncommon for comic publishers to have imprints. So when you're working for, let's say, in your case, Epic, are you given any more latitude in terms of what you can do if versus if you're working under, let's say, Marvel proper? You know, the work you do for Epic, or like, let's say, for comparison's sake, you know, DC has DC Black for which I don't know, lasted 10 minutes or something. And I guess they were trying to be a little darker with their material, a little bit more adult, I guess, if you will. Now, was that same true? Did that hold true for Epic, or was there, other than a different line of comics or other comics, was there like a different game plan as it pertains to those titles?
Sure. No, that's a great question. Yeah, Epic was an imprint created for some very specific reasons, right? It was creator owned for the most part. Later on, it would do some Marvel licensed, or not Marvel licensed characters, or Marvel characters, or like that Shadowline imprint. But it's an impetus, and most of its time was creator owned, which means the people own the properties. Marvel got a little piece of it. But it was still Mark DeMatteis and Kent Williams' property on Gru, or Sergio Aragonis's property. Oh, I'm sorry, on Blood. Sergio Aragonis's property on Gru. Those sort of things. The Peonies on ElfQuest. It's their property. Marvel was publishing it, taking a little piece of it, or a decent piece of it, but not in a way that was overwhelmingly out of their hands. That was unique, right? And that would do a couple of things. It would allow for an exploration of different eclectic comic type properties that weren't necessarily in the mainstream, which was of appeal, especially to Archie and Marvel, thinking about probably bookstore properties, things that were beyond the comic book store. And there was also sort of a little bit of jujitsu there, in the sense that people who might not want to work for Marvel, I don't want to work for Marvel, I don't want to work for big Marvel, they're the devil or whatever, would work for Archie Goodwin and would work for Epic. And if they had a good experience, which we were intent on giving them, like we would advise and we would guide, but we were also very creator friendly, in the sense of, we're going to take good care of you here. If they had a great experience with us, they were then maybe more inclined to say, a bigger talent, or a more just interesting talent, in some ways, what, I would like to do a Hulk book. I would like to do a Spider-Man book. So suddenly the creator who said, I will never do anything for Marvel, might be more inclined to do something, whether within the Epic zone, like an Elektra Assassin, right? Bill Sienkiewicz and Frank Miller, book. Or, maybe they would go over to Marvel and then take the sheen of the good Epic experience. And we were also pushing the envelope significantly in terms of production values. We were working with full illustrations, paintings, in Bill Sienkiewicz's part, full creations of dioramas on top of the page, and design wise, we had better paper, we had better publishing standards, so in a lot of ways we were pushing toward where a lot of the industry would go. Vertigo would ultimately end up doing a lot of this as well. We sort of had a friendly, I would say, competition with them, but I think they ultimately glommed around a better self-identity than we ever found ourselves with Epic, because you had so many different types of, you had wild humor here, you had dark stuff here, you had weird alien stuff here. So all very interesting, but not necessarily something could point to and say, you could point to Vertigo and sort of say, that's a Vertigo book. You could point to 5 different Epic books and say, okay, they all say Epic, but I'm not sure what ties them together. Aside from the fact they're really interesting and they're well produced and creator owned. So that was definitely an identity. And we also had an opportunity we didn't have the comics code. We didn't really have anybody looking over our shoulder except Archie. And Shooter would look over Archie's shoulder a little bit, but Shooter had big respect for Archie. So actually, I don't think he ever interfered with anything we did, at least to my knowledge. And so we were able to kind of just go in very big, bold directions and acquire properties and and then try to steer those creators to the best version of the work that they wanted to do, right? If I was smart now, as you know, then I would have been able to articulate that better, you know, say to a creative team, what is it you're trying to achieve? And then help steer them in that way more than I was probably doing it intuitively and saying, this doesn't really feel right for what you want to get to. How do we course correct it? And ultimately that was my responsibility, to help them get there.
Got it.
Why do you think the big two never revived this type of idea? Do you think it's because there are now so many more outlets for creator-owned books that they feel like, you know, why try it themselves, or they just want their toys and nobody else? They don't want anybody else to create toys that they can't have.
That may be it. I really don't know. I mean, I know at one point there was talk of an epic revival. Maybe there even was one in one form or another, but I think it's probably as they become more corporately bound, you know, by bigger corporations, there's just less interest. Disney doesn't really probably want anything that they don't own 100%, and it becomes you know, it becomes also like an internal operating confusion for some people. I mean, it was we were there, we were right next to everybody, right? You know, but the Epic identity and the Epic offices and the Epic comics were seen as kind of weird stuff, even by all the other people who were doing all these other comics in Marvel, right? So it was, so what do you guys do over there? What is that? I mean, I wasn't taken seriously until I wrote a Marvel comic, even though I'd written dozens of issues of that Shadowline, you know, stuff at that point, you know, and fabulous comics with fabulous artists and so forth. So I think now there probably is just not a reason for these corporation-owned companies, the big two, to want to do those things in that way. Exactly.
So moving back to the post Marvel freelance days, which obviously, you know, quite a few years after that, probably more than you were actually at Marvel proper. You work for a number of companies and a number of publishers, and you know, everything from Acclaim / Valiant to Dark Horse to imprints like Milestone and even Defiant, Jim Shooter's. I was just curious what your best experiences were in sort of exploring all of these different worlds and different publishers. Were there ones that were, you know, heads and shoulders above the rest? Were they kind of just different, but you know, at the same level?
These are great questions. I mean, most of the work I think was probably ultimately, you know, Marvel is going to be the most stuff that I did, right? You know, even with those other things, and it ultimately is really about the people for me more than the publisher, in some ways. So if you're working with a, you know, with a good team, you know, your editorial team, and the creative team that you're working with, that's what sticks out more to me than the Dark Horse identity or the Acclaim identity, you know, or the Valiant identity, that sort of thing. And I think for the most part, I was pretty lucky in having mostly really good folks going. The Defiant one was probably the least fun in a way, because it ended rather abruptly. I had sort of questioned one story point or something in this Charlemagne book that I was writing, and whoever was the next level below Jim at that point was okay. You clearly don't get it. You're off. It's like, wait, what just happened? Like, you know, I don't really. You know, there was just a bit of a rough edge, you know, to that. But I think again, it's just about the different groups were all a lot of fun and a lot of good personalities. It's not the best answer, you know, probably, but I think I was less I was less smart about directing myself and sort of like trying to kind of find one niche to go after. So assignments would kind of come into my lap, and I would try to make the best of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting sort of diversity
Yeah.
of work, and maybe that's probably what you were looking for. But I don't think we talk to many folks that have worked at so many or had their hands in so many different universes or work with so many publishers. So.
Really eclectic. I don't even know if you guys found one in your research here, talking about like diversity. I mean, there was a short-lived imprint called Nemesis that actually was by Harvey Comics that I was actually offered the editor-in-chief job at twice, and then they pulled the plug on it twice. But they had published one comic called Frank, which was a modern day take on Frankenstein with Dennis Cowan, which was amazing. They'd sort of come up with the general concept of it, and then gave me and Dennis this run on it. But that was weird. But the other one was Sequest, which was if you remember the show from the late 90s or mid 90s, so like Star Trek Undersea, and Roy Scheider was the star in it. And I remember distinctly the editor, Sid Jacobson, giving me the assignment saying, this thing's a little dull, jazz it up a little bit. Sid was a great guy. And so I did. We added a little more action to the standard show, which was a very kind of Star Trek The Next Generation, A story, B story, kind of, middling around stuff. Anyway, the action pissed Roy Scheider off so much, apparently, that he said, if this book continues, I'm off the show. So the book was canceled after one issue. But but that's diversity too. That was a lot of fun too. But that was great working with Sid, working with those guys. That's what I mean. It's just you have some very fun experiences. And comics is interesting to me, and probably I'm sure a lot of people, because while there's often big enterprises behind the publishing end of it and all these other pieces, you ultimately are working with a very small group of people to kind of achieve these things. You're with your art partner, you're with, you're talking to maybe a letterer, you're talking to like, an inker. It's a very small group who actually ends up creating, these really big, bold, adventures. One of the most fun projects I ever worked on was a Moby Dick adaptation with Bill Sienkiewicz, which was Classics Illustrated. Dark Horse did it. Dark Horse did it, I think. And it was taking, what's Moby Dick, 380 pages, down to 48. And it was basically me and Bill talking on the phone every day, if not every 2 hours, saying, how the hell are we going to do this? Cutting up the book and cutting up cliff notes and laughing, and then the editor's panicking because he hasn't seen anything, and he's, if we're going to get this thing out on time, how are you guys going to do it? It's like, don't worry about it, we got it. And which was probably just torturing him for no good reason, but working with Bill was just magic.
So I'm a huge horror fan. And
me too.
I enjoy. I could tell, obviously. So all right. So this is a two-parter. So I apologize in advance. So one, Nightstalkers. Really dig that for a couple of reasons. One, I love Blade, and I just and the horror aspect of it really appeals to me. Now, what was the what? How did that come about? Was it just beyond we want to put Blade in a team, or we want to, we want to build this like horror corner of the universe?
It's I think it's the latter, and I think there's the dotted crooked line from the story I told of Terror at the beginning, right? Remember I said initially they said, hey, we want a crypt keeper, we want to bring together all these books, all these weird characters, and then suddenly that vanished. Well, where did that go? Well, all those horror characters, to some extent, started to be co-opted by Bobby Chase, who was the editor-in-chief, editor overall of what would become the Midnight Suns. Now, Bobby was good friends. This is somewhat anecdotal, but I'm pretty sure it's somewhat accurate too. Bobby was good friends with Bob Harris. Bob Harris was the X-Men editor who had been very successful with a line of books, family of books. Says to Bobby, what you need is not titles in your office, Incredible Hulk, Ghost Rider. You need a family of books. So to some extent, you know, the impetus becomes Bobby wanting to create a supernatural X-Men. So they've got all these different characters. Of course, Ghost Rider is going to be in there because Ghost Rider is big and successful. Well, you had these other scattered characters, but nobody knew what to do with them, right? Well, maybe we should use Morbius. He's kind of a vampire and kind of a superhero. Oh, Len Kaminsky's got a proposal he's been carrying around in his leather jacket for ever, you know. No. And I was approached, I think because I had featured Ghost Rider in a Daredevil issue, and Bobby had said specifically, wow, you did a really nice job with that, and had told that to Howard, which Howard hated because Howard didn't want anybody else writing Ghost Rider well. And I think the world of Howard. So he told me this story. So he was the one who probably said, oh, you know, you should get Dan on another book. So he's not looking at Ghost Rider anymore. So Bobby approached me and said, we have these three characters. They're all vampire related, right? Blade, Hannibal King, Frank Drake. We don't know what to do with them, but they're vampire-ish. They're, you know, and so would you write a proposal? No, that was it, right? And she must have gone to many other people, right? It wasn't just me. So I went back and I knew Blade, but wasn't really as up on the other ones as in the same way. But as I did my research into them, the creative conceit was just, wait a minute, these guys have had their lives ruined by the supernatural, right? They shouldn't be embracing this. They're not Doctor Strange. They're not like, you know, let me cast a spell because the supernatural is so great to me. They've had everything destroyed because of the supernatural. So why wouldn't they be the angriest anti-supernatural, you know, 90s gritted teeth Ghostbusters basically possible, even though I didn't describe it that way. Essentially, that's what it was. So, you know, that's what I went back to them with and said, here's the proposal. I had written it up. I named it Nightstalkers, you know, and I was really nervous because I said, oh, you know, there's an old TV show called Night Stalker, which Bobby knew nothing about. And it was like, she could have cared less, you know, so I was like overanalyzing it. I had even designed the logo sort of with some weird little like drop shadowy, you know, early Macintosh font program. And so, you know, they had lifted my, not thinking that it was going to be something, but that's kind of like where the logo even came from. And, you know, pitched it to them and they were like, yeah, you're in. And then, so we had sort of the general idea of Night Stalkers. Obviously, we knew what Ghost Rider was. Len had his Morbius character. Chris Cooper had been carrying around his Darkhold proposal, like the ultimate nepotism. And Chris is, again, a great guy. So when I say these things, this is not a ding. But, you know, he's Bobby's assistant. He's like, oh, by the way, I've got a, you know, I'm right in your office. He's like Dick Cheney, you know, sort of like, you know, moving right in. Which he would hate if he ever hears that. So we may need to cut that. No, but nothing tied them together yet, right? They were just supernatural. So we would go away. We went away on a long weekend or a couple of days during the week, like a retreat. Marvel actually paid for us to go to a conference center, and I brought along my stack of supernatural books, you know, most of which are back in that corner with the devil right now. And we just started to talk, you know, what is it going to be and why are they coming together and what's tying them and who's their big villain and blah, blah, blah. And over those 2 days is where the general construct for the Midnight Suns and Lilith, you know, would rise up, and the name of the Midnight Suns would come out of, you know, riffing on things. And either I would open up, you know, some book and, you know, quote some dark passage from, you know, some Necronomicon, or Len infamously would like light a cigarette and go outside and come back with here's an idea. And ultimately we cooked up all the tentpole stuff from that point, and then had, I think we might even have the initial beats, you know, for those first set of stories, you know, knowing that, okay, you know, it's going to start here. Ghost Rider is going to pass the baton to Morbius or whatever the sequence was. And so we then knew who had to pick up what to deliver that first kind of origin of the Midnight Suns.
Okay. Curious, and you don't have to answer this one. Your take on how they were somewhat portrayed in Blade 3.
I honestly, I remember somebody saying the word Night Stalkers, and that's kind of all that like not appealed to me, but I guess stays with me. It certainly doesn't seem like it was a real attempt to do anything with it beyond like somebody heard the name and said, "Oh, we need a name for these characters. We're going to call them the Night Stalkers."
Yeah.
So I don't even think I don't think they gave thank you credits at that point in time. So
fair enough.
Blade 3 didn't leave much of an impression on me, or anybody else for that matter.
True, good point. So the second part of my question was really about Hellraiser. I've recently got into some of the newer, titles or the continuations of the Hellraiser stories, and what's that experience like? Are you working with Clive Barker, or are there notes coming from him or something like that? Because it ain't Marvel. This is
it ain't Marvel.
It ain't Marvel. This is some heavy shit. As pertains to like I remember reading Hellraiser comics after watching the movie, and I was like thoroughly freaked out from a comic. And I was
good,
like, all right,
good. Thank you.
And
mission accomplished.
Yeah. So, and the new one that's coming out too. I can't wait for that.
Yeah, a month or so, right?
Yeah. Yeah. What's that experience like in terms of creating a Hellraiser comic?
That was magical. I mean, that was as close as you're probably hopefully ever going to get to actually opening a puzzle box on your own and going right down to. What's the line from Hellraiser? Such sights to show you.
Yeah.
Angels to some, devils to others. What's your pleasure? All those things were real, as far as I was concerned, and it was a little bit of the, don't ask for something. What's the old phrase? Don't ask for something you don't want to get.
Yeah.
Or whatever. I've been bugging Archie forever to do a horror comic, like a horror anthology, horror fan, horror anthologies. Archie had done Warren's horror comics, famously, he'd been the editor and, wrote many of those stories. And he was like, shut up, kid. You know what you're talking about. Because horror doesn't sell, right? It doesn't, that not in that way. It needs a hook, needs an identity. Just another creepy or eerie or whatever is not gonna cut it. But what could cut it was Clive Barker, right? So Clive Barker was on fire with his books. Stephen King gives him the future with that quote, I've seen the future of horror, and his name is Clive Barker. Hellraiser had come out. Hellraiser 2 maybe had come out, at that point. Nightbreed was going to be in production soon. He was the enfant terrible, of horror, right? And so he was a well-known quantity, and it turned out he wanted to come in and talk to Marvel about comics, because Marvel had been bought by New World at that point, New World Pictures, and New World Pictures had produced the Hellraiser films. So, they were looking for synergies. New World was looking for, what can you turn to a comic? Can you turn whatever shitty movie they had into a comic? So there was talk about, can you do a Hellraiser comic? Well, Clive Barker, of course, wanted to meet Archie Goodwin, right? And, it was my most terrible moment, probably, of utter fanboyness, where, when we knew Clive was coming in, and usually who was our assistant at that point was Mark Chiarello. Mark Chiarello was overqualified to be the assistant at Epic by several galactic, rings. If you don't know, Mark Chiarello would later become, the art editor at DC, as well as being an incredibly accomplished artist and creator in his own right. But anyway, he would normally go meet the people who would come to visit, the offices. And as soon as I, heard him say, "Oh yes, Mr. Barker, I'll come get you," I literally pushed Mark out of the way. to go to the front, you know, and fanboy Squee and lead him back. But he didn't care about me, you know, at that point. You know, he went into the office with Archie, the door closed. They talked for a while, and then he left. And then after he left, Archie came in and said, "All right, you get what you wish for. You know, you're going to edit Hellraiser, right? We're going to do an anthology comic around Hellraiser," which was like, holy shit, you know, be careful what you wish for, right? You're going to get it. So suddenly this monumental project of epic proportions, no pun intended, you know, is in my lap. But now what do you do with it? Is it just people opening puzzle boxes and chains come out every story? That's going to get old really quick. So, you know, you asked about working, you know, did Clive give you notes? Clive gave us every bit of time you could possibly imagine. The most generous creator I could ever have wished for. Every phone call, every meeting, you were the center of attention. And he gave us a demonstrable amount of time in sitting down and breaking down what is hell. What's that giant diamond thing, you know, in Hellraiser 2? What does it mean? What do the Cenobites really represent? And so we took all these conversations away, and I went away and wrote a Bible. I wrote the Bible of Hellraiser, you know, which I still have, one of the few things I actually have from the old days. And we broke this down, and this explained not only the types of stories we wanted, which was not just one-note EC Comics things. We didn't want morality plays. We wanted things that would disturb you. We wanted things that would get under your skin. We wanted things that would be Clive Barker, that would explore these dark corners, that would make you question and think about things. And we then started to circulate this out to creators. And, you know, we swung big. You know, who could we get? Could we get an Alan Moore? Could we get a Neil Gaiman? Could we get that, you know, I was pretty shameless in going after some, and we scored some wins, some people I never heard back from ever. But that was a place where, you know, he gave us the keys to his world and let us explore it based upon this Bible, which he had co-developed, you know, with us. I was the author, but he would go back and say, yeah, that's good. Maybe goose this up or tone this down. And then he had a look at every story, but his notes were always just keep doing what you're doing. You know, he was, I believe firmly that we had established like a level of trust and understanding and celebration of what he was trying to do with his work that we continued through here. And like all anthologies, you know, Rod Serling, I think, you know, famously said, you know, about the Twilight Zone, you know, a third are really good, a third are okay, and a third are dogs. And maybe that's just the formula for anthologies, because I think that's probably ultimately, you know, where a lot of the Hellraiser work ended up, you know, because we tried to amass so much stuff to get ahead of the schedule. You know, some things were that kind of EC Comics morality play, but some of them were deeply worrisome and scary things, or things that would, you know, get under your skin, which I'm very, you know, proud of that we did. And that would make you sort of like, oh, wow, that's weird. And we had, I mean, there's fabulous art in those books. I mean, we had those sort of, not just the covers, but we had like those bumper pages where we would have, you know, to kind of bridge, you know, one story to the next. We had just, you know, people doing these incredible Cenobite designs and such. And those are just some trippy, psychedelic, mind-bending stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's probably why, out of, you know, there's all kinds of horror stuff out there, you know, genres. And, you know, you have your high level Freddy Jason, which is fun.
Yep.
Yep,
absolutely.
You go to. But something about Hellraiser, when you watch it or read it, it's just a little creepier, you know? You know, like I've seen all the Saw movies, and I'm like, okay, well, that's whatever that is, and that's fine. But I don't feel creeped out for some reason as the way I do when it comes to Hellraiser. And I don't know what it is. Maybe it's the you know, it's the design of the Cenobites, the story itself, a combination of everything. But, you know, home run there. So
I think it's ultimately that you're being invited into this world.
Yeah.
And there's a seductive power to it. You know, ultimately the movies, I think I've only watched the first 3, and yet I know they're up to like 10 or 12. They kept going. They were like the Energizer Bunny of horror franchises. And at a certain point, Pinhead became more of a jokey, Freddy character, and there was a certain, I'll say, morality to even those first 2 or 3 films where the good people triumphed.
Yeah.
But it was almost like, oh yeah, we have to tack that on, or it kind of happened by happenstance. The majority of those films and those ideas, and if you mainline Barker, as I did for many years, is it's seductive. You're being invited into that world, and you're questioning, why is this so appealing to me? Why is this appealing? That's the whole essence of the puzzle, I think, right? There's something that's happening here that's unlocking things not only to an other dimension, but in myself. And that's the level of disturbance. Nobody really wants to hang with Freddy. Certainly nobody wants to hang with Jason, and you're not necessarily wanting to hang with the Cenobites, but I think it's giving you permission, to explore these darker, stranger things. And you're convincing yourself you're one step removed, but, before you know it, you're like, you're saying Jesus wept and fighting the chains and to, rip you up. So,
yeah.
And there was a lot. The best of those stories in the comic, I'll stand by them. I mean, would explore really strange things. There was one Ted McKeever story that always stood out to me. It might have been the first or second issue, where he had this little fetus, like a microscopic fetus who's the mother is the one who opens the puzzle box, and she of course gets tortured and taken to hell, but he then pops up and he's like, what about me? And the Cenobite has to have like this philosophical conversation with him about where he stands. And it's this weird little trippy, typically Ted McKeever imaginative, strange, exploratory thing. But that's where the book was at its best, because that's not something you're going to find in a lot of other
absolutely
comics or stories.
So Dan, I can't believe we've gone this long without mentioning Daredevil, although you did mention it in relation to Ghost Rider being a guest star.
Exactly, yes.
So I would be remiss if we didn't spend a little time there, because you spent a lot of time with that character.
I did, yeah.
I'm wondering first about kind of the origins of how you got onto the character, and whether Daredevil was one of the characters you always wanted to write, or did you kind of find your way into it once you were given the assignment?
Probably the latter. And I think that, I thought Daredevil was a great character, just a fun character overall. Certainly many of us at that point, coming off of Frank Miller's, bigger resurgence. Born Again hadn't been that long ago. And, the big, the big power of that story. But as I was transitioning into that freelance, gig, going on my own, and I was impossibly young. I even when I was doing that Barker stuff, I was like, what, was it 25, 28, if that. And it was like just nuts, which was about the same time, I was doing Daredevil. And I had done the Shadow line. I'd done Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. I'd done a couple of other things, but I didn't feel qualified to do Marvel's real characters. I'd made my bones yet. I hadn't proved myself to myself, let alone a lot of other people. But Steve Buccellato, who was a friend, is a friend of mine, was also my assistant when I was at Epic, called me over Thanksgiving and told me, Anne's leaving the book, Anne Nesenti's leaving the book, and you should try for it, which never would I have thought to do. If I had heard Anne was leaving on my own, it's like, oh, I wonder who's going to take her place. Steve saying, you should try for it. Ralph really likes your work. Ralph Macchio, who's the editor, likes your SHIELD stuff, you should really try out for the book. And, what are you talking about? I'm not ready for this, but it's stuck in my head. It's one of those germ of things like, that you sort of can't get rid of even if you want to. And so I called Ralph up and I said, listen, I hear Anne's leaving. Do you think I could take a swing at the book? And Ralph was a great guy and, said, yeah, sure. He's totally laid back. But, reading between the lines, even then, I'm pretty sure it was like Ralph being a nice guy. Yeah, sure. What the heck? Then, do whatever you want, Dan, But I wrote a proposal, and which I still have. And it was basically, the conceit of my proposal was that we cannot keep going with this character confronting the Kingpin and doing if you cross this line one more time, fat man, I'm taking you down. Oh, you crossed the line again. Well, the next time you cross the line, then I'm definitely taking you down. And it had just become to me a hollow construct. And so my proposal was we take him down. We go to the roots of it and we take him down. It wasn't meant to be a reversal on Born Again. I think some people, looked at it that way. It was never an intention to mirror that in that way, but it was to get the Kingpin down, really down. And that was my pitch. And the second part of the pitch was, to treat New York as a character, to treat the city of New York as character and the richness of Hell's Kitchen and beyond that as things that we could distinctly work with and not just be water towers. So lo and behold, Ralph calls me up and you got the book. And it's like, and now I'm on the on-ramp, not only to the book, but we're on the on-ramp to 300, which of course has to be a seminal, big deal issue by comics numbering standards. And then I was amazingly paired with Lee Weeks, who was in much the same position I was, right? Interested in the character, hadn't yet proved himself. And so we bonded, not consciously, we didn't ever sit down and say, boy, we're like, we're young, whatever, and we haven't made our bones and this is our chance to do it. But intuitively, we knew that's where we were. And so I think there was just raw energy of try anything, do anything, let's impress ourselves, each other. And we had just a rip of a time, doing that. And that was the non-thinking about that book at that time. And that run is probably what made it successful, which I think most creative endeavors do become successful when you don't think about them. Your tools are allowed to kind of activate themselves, but you're not thinking about, oh, I'm going to work this theme in here. Oh, I'm going to work this whatever in here, I'm not talking about plot points or character points, but, I wasn't doing for an agenda or this or that. I was following my gut instincts, and then ultimately the characters were creating the story for us. I really feel that way.
Yeah, it's such a great run. It was right at sort of the height of my reading and collecting. And so I remember it well. I remember Lee Weeks' art very well, who I consider so underappreciated, especially during that time. I think he's now gotten a lot more of his due.
Absolutely.
But yeah, during that time, I think I was like, why aren't you looking over here? I mean, it was the Image time and things where it had to be muscles upon muscles and really out there. So maybe his more subtle work was
but very
lost,
powerful.
Very powerful.
Yeah.
Very powerful and great storytelling.
Yeah.
So you kind of covered my question on Fall of the Kingpin. But I did want to talk about another major storyline, or rather maybe inflection point, Fall from Grace, and basically the introduction of a new costume. First of all, did you have any input into that? And second, although maybe the second first would be, was that given to you as something to do, or did you bring it up? How did that all come about?
That's interesting. It's, you know, it's a question that's come up, it seems, a little bit more in the last few months as I've done a couple podcasts or whatever, which never really occurred to me before. There seems to be this feeling that, you know, we must have been given this, you know, and forced, quote unquote, to do these things. But you know, we did it all for good or bad. And the reason we did it all was, you know, we loved the character, we loved working with the office, we loved everything else, but the character wasn't doing that great. Certainly that's probably our responsibility as well, right? If it wasn't tracking big on sales, well, whatever stories we were telling maybe weren't resonating. But it was also, you know, an aspect of things that you're kind of promised, again, from promotion and you know, get some attention on my book. We'll do this. We'll have a guest star. We'll go here. We'll have these events or these crossovers, and ultimately certain things just weren't paid off. You know, we weren't given our due, and there was a lot of that at the time. You know, if you weren't a spider or a mutant, you weren't getting a lot of promotion. And yet the last things that probably needed promotional dollars behind them were the spiders and the mutants. You know, what about us over here? What about the blind guy? You know, so, you know, we said we want to go all out, right? We're going to go all out and do something, again, aiming for a number, right? 325 felt like a, you know, a big number to kind of aim at. How do we upend Matt Murdock's life yet again? And what are the things that we can start putting in here? And granted, some of them were tropes or expected things. Let's change the costume, right? Nobody's done that in a while. It's a manufactured item, granted, but we wanted to integrate it into the story. There was a reason that it was going to happen, not just like one day he shows up and says, I think I'll stop at the costume shop and get it. You know, we put him up against these bigger threats and made an argument that he's a smart guy. Red jammies aren't necessarily going to cut it. Maybe a little bit more protection would make sense. Which you kind of saw on the TV show, and I finally finally Star-Lord. But there was so that was one thing. And then, you know, we said we're going to generate some attention. Let's get some guest stars in here. But again, let's try to integrate them into the story. And then the final piece of it was actually, you know, as we were developing the pieces around the story, and we sort of had the main construct around it, and we're sitting around with Ralph, and then out of the blue, Ralph Macchio was the one who said, well, did you give any thought to bringing Elektra back? And which shocked the hell out of us, and shocked the hell out of me, because at some point earlier in the run, you know, we had sort of touched on it once or twice, and you know, anything we could do with Elektra, you know, Ralph, do you think that's something we might want to play with? No, we don't want to do that. We don't want to touch that. And the fact that he brought it up was unusual. And of course we just grabbed it and then said, all right, that's kind of the missing piece to this, right? That's ultimately what Fall from Grace is, more than Murdoch's problems, is it's Elektra's fall from grace, in my mind. And so we had all these pieces, and then the trick was to try to make it work. And, you know, if it works, it's probably one proton away from, you know, total nuclear fission and the whole thing blowing up, because there's so much crammed into that story. And it's vibrating, you know, at the seams in a lot of ways. If I could go back and redo it, I would simplify things a little bit more. But it was meant to be an event, and ultimately it worked, right? It did get a lot of attention. It did boost the sales. Some of that was also me and Scott paid out of pocket and hired an outside publicist to goose things, you know, along the way. I think it was also a lot because a lot of people didn't believe in us, and Miller's book was coming out at the same time. Was A Man Without Fear, right? Yeah, that was the Miller book that was coming out around the same time. That was the book that was getting all the attention from promotion. All of a sudden it's Miller time, you know, was the ad. And I was like, it's a beer ad, guys. Like, you know, a little originality here. But and I said to them, I said, you are validating the idea that the only time this character is good is when Frank Miller writes it. And when Frank Miller writes it, it's great. No, don't take anything away from that. Sure. But you've got to open up, the ability to flex this character. I mean, look at what they do now, right? He's all over the place. Mm-hmm. But that was our everything but the kitchen sink, attempt to get, against all odds, the attention back on the character and the book, and by and large it worked.
I enjoyed the hell out of it. Yes. I'll tell you that much. I know there's certainly differing opinions because of the everything. Right. Well, you sort of alluded to the everything but the kitchen sink approach, right? Which is probably not everybody's cup of tea.
Yeah.
I certainly love the costume. I love the return of Elektra. I think I was probably in the right frame of reference because I had come in after Miller and hadn't read any of that stuff. So Elektra was almost like a new character to me. But I thought her return was really well handled and definitely made an intriguing entry point, at least for me, for that character. Made me want to go back and
very cool.
So yeah, I really enjoyed the entire run, both of those stories, and so I just say thank you for those.
Well, thank you. No, I appreciate that. That's definitely the intention behind it, was to have people have a good time, and I think I know we were, even with the everything but the kitchen sink approach, being mindful about trying to tell a good story, right? There was reasons, at least within that internal rationale, why characters were showing up and why guest stars were there, and why things were meant to be happening. Again, maybe it's not always totally successful, but I think there's a lot of really great moments, within it.
I completely agree.
I will tell you a funny story about like after comics was not so hot for me anymore. I went to I went to a game company in Massachusetts, and they wanted to do a presentation on storytelling, right? Comic storytelling and how it might apply to games and such. So I did it. And it was very, went over well. And then they said, "Oh, come out to dinner with us," So I went out to dinner with these guys, and they were talking about comics, and then one guy was like, "Man, they just do some stuff in comics I don't understand at all. Like some idiot went and changed Daredevil's costume. Like, what's that all about?" It's like, check, like, no.
You just reach across the table. You look here.
Yeah, exactly. Pretty much. You're looking at the idiot, And
I like it.
Yeah.
The sort of all the ninja / samurai aspects to it, I thought were well
no, it was
worked
right.
in.
Right.
Made sense.
I like that costume. I mean,
it's a good. There's a great toy actually. Like they just finally came out with an amazing toy of it, which I was shocked. But I realized the problem with the costume, after the fact was that the only person who really drew it well was Scott McDaniel, because he was always thinking about it the way that he had designed it and the way that we talked about it, which was that it was an extension of Matt. It was an extension of what he wanted to do. He needed to be more protected, but he still needed to be Daredevil and Matt Murdock and be flexible. Yep. So it felt like live and sort of alive. Most other people, not everybody, but I would say most other people just looked at it and said armor, and then just treated it all like it was bolt-ons and pads and layers. And I just recently, for various reasons, just read the after stories, like after I left the book, when they just destroyed the costume, and the venom for that outfit was just off the charts. I mean, it was internally, like within the book itself, it was just crazy. Where they went, but also I think just the misunderstanding around it, like the misunderstanding of what we had stated was the reason for it, and how good it could work when a Scott was doing it, but everybody else just interpreted it as not everybody, but some people interpret it as this, this shield and this bulky shield versus anything else.
So before we go, I know you went and got yourself one of those like fancy corporate jobs, but where can, if you're on social media, where can fans follow you?
Well, I'm fairly active on Twitter, I guess, not phenomenally, but I mean, they can always find me as just DG Chichester on there. That's probably the best place. I have a newsletter, which I've gone fallow on, but I need to pick it back up. So this will be my charge to do that. So it's storymaze.substack.com. So that's was pretty regular. And then I sort of fell off the wagon and need to get back into it. But that was more or less every week. I would, I've got some original writing in there. I've got some history of comics, that I've worked on, usually something else that I like from a storytelling point of view. So that's a good way to, check out things if people are interested in this conversation or just knew me from something else.
Okay. And we're back. I love talking to DG. Just the fact that I got to say DG is pretty cool. We had a great discussion about his time working on the Hellraiser series, which is something I really love. You don't hear too many people talking about that, but it's a cool series. If you're a fan of the movie, like I am, certainly a little freaky. And if you've seen the newer movie, even freakier. But the comic book is really good, and we got into that as you heard, and it was really cool. So I love talking to him.
Yeah, his breaking into the biz story was very interesting as well. Becoming an assistant to the editor-in-chief, Jim Shooter. So we got to know, as you heard, how that worked out, and then again getting through those epic comics, which was such an interesting imprint from Marvel. And then up through Daredevil and all of the other credits that, we discussed. Just a really fascinating career and a great conversationalist. So thank you, DG Chichester. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Mike.
And thank you, listeners, for diving back into another great interview with the Dollar Bin Bandits. So we will leave it there. Thank you again. Please remember to rate, review, and subscribe, and we will see you next time.